July 1, 1882. Northern Dakota Territory, a railside town and surrounding claims. Fresh tin gutters glint along a new false front store. A warm thunderstorm has just passed. Water still drips from awnings, and muddy splash marks climb a foot up every unpainted wall on the street. Army and Signal Service records from 1870 through 1890 show summer thunderstorms on the northern plains, dropping 1 to 2 inches of rain in under an hour. A 20 by 40-foot roof converts that into more than 500 gallons directed into narrow troughs along the eaves. Most board frame buildings in town rely on straight 4 to 5-inch gutters pitched to corner downspouts that dump water inches from their sill timbers. A smaller number of farmsteads outside town show a different pattern in photographs and site surveys. Gutters bowed slightly in the middle, discharging over stone several feet out from the wall. Over the next decade of storms, freeze-thaw cycles, and repair bills, the question is simple: which detail keeps its lower walls sound? Early thaw morning, 1883. Eastern Dakota Territory, near the Red River Valley. Ice lenses still ring fence posts. The north side of a frame house shows a damp band along the bottom boards where snow had drifted and then melted. The Great Dakota Boom was in full surge. Population figures tell the story with stark clarity. In 1870, Dakota Territory counted 11,766 residents. By 1890, that number would exceed 300,000. The Northern Pacific Railroad punched west through the territory, and the Homestead Act pulled settlers into a zone that, until recently, had been trading post country and little else. Rail corridors dictated town locations. Builders arrived with Eastern framing methods, techniques proven in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois. What worked in those regions met a different climate and soil regime on the northern plains. The typical wall assembly followed a standard pattern. Stone or block piers, sometimes a low rubble foundation, supported a 6 by 6 inch or log sill. Above that rose a balloon or platform frame, sheathed with planks and covered with lap siding. No damp-proof course separated wood from masonry. The grade often came within inches of the sill height and sometimes touched it. Climate data from the period reveals the challenge. Average annual precipitation across the Red River Valley and eastern Dakota ranged from 15 to 20 inches, modest by eastern standards. But recorded extremes told a different story. Single storms dropped 2 inches or more in an afternoon. Spring snowmelt combined with rain to flood low-lying areas for weeks. The number of days with snow cover stretched from November into April. Freeze-thaw cycles, periods when temperature crossed the freezing point within 24 hours, occurred dozens of times each winter. Documentary fragments. From territorial histories and agricultural bulletins, note wet springs with consistent regularity. Army quartermaster reports from frontier posts describe repeated requests for replacement sill timbers. State climatology records compiled from Signal Service data outline 1860s through 1880s precipitation and flood events that exceeded any pattern settlers had known in their home states. The cause and effect relationship was straightforward, but not yet widely understood. Light timber frames, low sills, and bare soil around foundations combined with intense storms to keep lower walls repeatedly wet. Wood that stays wet long enough begins to decay. Softwood sills, pine, spruce, cottonwood, are especially vulnerable. The fungi that cause rot require moisture content above fiber saturation for extended periods. On the northern plains, where summer storms alternate with spring snowmelt and autumn rains, unprotected lower walls spent much of the year above that threshold. Preservation surveys conducted decades later would document the pattern. Buildings from the 1870s and 80s that survived into the 20th century often showed one telltale sign. The lowest course of siding, and sometimes the sill itself, had been replaced at least once. In some county records, replacement appeared twice within a building's first 20 years. In county after county, the first generation of painted board houses needed new lower courses before the mortgages were paid. 1878, a frontier hardware store in western Minnesota near the Dakota line. A clerk unpacks a shipment of 4-inch and 5-inch half-round gutters and elbows. The order follows a pattern book specification: straight runs, corner downspouts, catalog correct. Gutters, as pictured in Eastern builders' guides, were supposed to protect walls by catching roof runoff and sending it away. The logic seemed sound. Without gutters, water sheeted off eaves and struck the ground immediately beside the foundation. With gutters, water was collected and directed to controlled discharge points. The improvement appeared obvious. 19th century gutter practice followed established patterns. Early systems used wood eaves troughs formed from boards or hewn logs, sometimes tin-lined. Later systems employed galvanized metal half-round or box gutters fixed to the eave with wood pins or iron brackets. Period guidance described drop gutters or wooden downspouts at building corners. Standard instruction was simple: pitch gutters uniformly toward the corners, place drops at building ends. The numbers behind a typical installation reveal the hidden problem. A 20 by 40 foot gable roof covers 800 square feet. 1 inch of rain, 1/12 of a foot, yields roughly 66.7 cubic feet of water. At 7.48 gallons per cubic foot, that equals approximately 500 gallons from a single moderate storm. In a high-intensity thunderstorm dropping 2 inches in an hour, the volume doubles to 1,000 gallons. Standard gutter practice concentrated that entire load into 2 discharge points, one at each building corner. When those downspouts terminated a few inches from the wall onto bare soil, as was typical, the result was predictable. Concentrated flow striking loose earth created turbulence. Droplet splash could reach 150 to 600 millimeters up masonry or siding, well into the lower courses. Modern moisture research has quantified what 19th century builders learned through experience. Splashback from uncontrolled discharge is a primary cause of decay in the lower portions of historic structures. National Park Service conservation guidance now identifies repeated wetting of the base via splashback and rising damp as the leading factor in sill and lower siding failure in buildings without proper ground clearance or damp-proof courses. The phenomenon was understood empirically long before it was codified. Builders in damp climates had always known to keep wood away from wet ground. What changed on the frontier was the introduction of a modern system, gutters, that inadvertently made the problem worse by concentrating discharge exactly where light timber construction was most vulnerable. The cause and effect relationship was invisible until buildings aged. For the first few seasons, guttered buildings looked better maintained than those without. Paint stayed cleaner. Eaves showed less staining. But within 5 to 10 years, a pattern emerged. Buildings with standard corner discharge gutters began showing decay at predictable locations. The sill ends, the lower courses of siding directly above and beside downspout terminations, and the shallow rubble footings immediately adjacent to discharge points. The very hardware meant to save the walls gave water a preferred path to the weakest timber in the frame. 1890s. A preservation survey team walks a 19th century farmhouse 20 miles west of Fargo. The gutter line bows slightly toward the middle of the south elevation. Underneath that low point sits a pad of rounded fieldstone, not bare earth. The sill timber above is original and sound. The observation prompts closer examination. Measured elevations show the gutter center 10 to 20 millimeters lower than the corners across a 6-meter run. 2 short downspout stubs appear near the lowest point, spaced a meter apart. Each terminates above the stone pad, which projects roughly 1 meter from the wall. The pattern is not unique to this building. Surveys of carriage barns and farm-out buildings across the northern plains occasionally document similar configurations. Carved stone troughs or precast masonry splash blocks appear under downspouts designed to catch and break falling water. Some examples show shallow rubble trenches extending from the stone pad's downslope, acting as primitive French drains to carry water further from foundations. Historic photographs provide additional evidence. In images of farmsteads from the 1880s and 90s, central downspouts and stone aprons are sometimes visible in the background, barely noticeable unless one knows to look. Masonry product literature from the early 20th century describes splash blocks and stone channels placed to keep water off foundations, suggesting that what began as improvised solutions became standardized products. The technical principle behind these systems can be reconstructed without speculation. A gutter installed with a deliberate belly, a gentle sag toward the center, defines where water will accumulate and where overflow must occur. By controlling the low point, the builder controls the discharge zone. Placing that zone over stone rather than soil and positioning it 1 meter or more from the wall rather than a few inches changes the impact dynamics completely. Stone does not erode. Stone does not become saturated. Stone breaks the kinetic energy of falling water into lateral flow and minor spray rather than concentrated impact and deep splash. Water striking stone spreads and drains away before it can pond against the base of the wall. Masonry product catalogs and later farmstead management manuals describe this logic explicitly. Early agricultural experiment station bulletins recommend grading soil away from building foundations and placing durable materials, stone, brick, or concrete, at points where roof runoff is concentrated. The language in these documents suggests they are codifying existing practice rather than inventing new techniques. The cause and effect relationship is visible in the buildings themselves. Preservation reports note that where stone aprons, good grading, or central discharge patterns are present, lower walls are more often original timber. Where corner downspouts discharged onto bare soil, sill repairs and siding replacement are documented more frequently in maintenance records and county histories. Where the gutters bent inward and the water fell on rock, surveyors found an uncommon combination: softwood sills still doing their original job. 1880 through 1900. County seats and homesteads across Dakota Territory and western Minnesota. A county clerk sorts invoices at a government office. Alongside bridge planking and school roofing sits a bill for lifting frame and splicing decayed northeast sill on a 10-year-old mercantile store. The documentation is matter-of-fact. County histories and farm memoirs describe repeated sill and lower siding replacement within 10 to 15 seasons, especially on weather-side corners. The frequency varies by building and location, but the pattern is consistent enough to appear in multiple independent sources. Preservation case studies of Great Plains buildings from this era routinely note decay concentrated at downspout discharge locations. The technical and economic details reveal the burden. Splicing a sill requires lifting the building frame with jacks, inserting temporary blocking to support loads, cutting away decayed sections, fitting new 6x6 or larger timbers into place, and resecuring the structure. The operation demands skilled labor and consumes multiple days. Lower siding replacement on a typical elevation requires 200 to 300 board feet of lumber, plus nails, caulking, and paint. Each element carries a cost. Freight schedules from the period show lumber arriving by rail at specific tariffs per hundredweight, adding transport expense to material cost. A Northern Pacific Railroad freight table from 1885 lists dressed pine at rates that made building materials a significant portion of any homesteader's or merchant's budget. In counties where local timber was scarce, every repair meant waiting for the next shipment and paying premium prices. The contrast between building approaches becomes stark in the record. Quick builds that followed catalog gutter details without ground grading or splash control show more frequent maintenance entries. Slower builds where drainage and wall clearance were prioritized from the start show fewer structural interventions over the same span of years. Farm account books occasionally survive in historical society collections. Some show yearly entries for paint and minor upkeep with no major structural work for decades. Others list sill splicing, foundation patching, or lower course replacement every few seasons. When these ledgers can be correlated with building details through photographs, site surveys, or physical inspection, a pattern emerges. Buildings that concentrated water at two corners without splash control show more frequent and more extensive sill and siding repairs than those with managed drainage. The cause and effect relationship is documented but was not widely publicized at the time. Individual builders and carpenters learned through direct experience. Owners who paid for repeated repairs at the same corners began asking questions about gutter layout and drainage. Builders who saw the pattern adjusted their practice on subsequent jobs. Knowledge spread through informal networks rather than published manuals. Where freight receipts list replacement sill timber twice in 20 years, the roofline almost always tells the same story: straight runs, corner drops, bare ground. Analytical chapter referencing 19th century structures and modern building science translated into period-appropriate terms. A simple field test demonstrates the principle. A test board is propped 30 centimeters from bare soil under an eave after a controlled water flow from above. The lower half of the board shows mud speckling. The upper half is nearly clean. The boundary between wet and dry marks the effective splash reach height under those specific conditions. Contemporary damp-proofing standards place damp-proof courses, impermeable barriers between masonry and timber, at least 150 millimeters above finished grade, specifically to account for splashback. Conservation manuals prepared by the National Park Service and other preservation agencies assume that the lower 150 to 300 millimeters of any wall will be periodically wet from splash, rising damp, or both. Modern building codes mandate clearances and water management techniques designed around this reality. Applying these principles to 19th century frontier construction reveals why so many buildings experienced rapid decay at their bases. Typical wall assemblies began only a few inches above uneven ground. No capillary break separated stone piers from wooden sills. Organic debris, leaves, grass clippings, manure from animals accumulated against siding. When corner downspouts added concentrated flow to this already vulnerable zone, the result was predictable. The mechanics of splashback depend on several factors. The height from which water falls determines impact energy. A gutter discharging from 3 meters above grade delivers more kinetic energy than one at 2 meters, producing higher and more forceful splash. The soil surface matters as well. Loose, bare earth creates more turbulent splash than compacted soil or vegetated ground. The volume and velocity of discharge affect both splash height and the depth to which surrounding soil becomes saturated. Approximate numbers help quantify the problem. Droplets from a gutter discharge can reach vertical heights of 150 to 600 millimeters on various soil surfaces, depending on flow rate and fall distance. Horizontal splash radius can extend several hundred millimeters in all directions from the impact point. For a building with its sill only 100 to 200 millimeters above grade, even modest splash regularly wets the lowest timber course. The concept of wet hours provides another perspective. This term describes the cumulative time per season during which wood remains above fiber saturation point, the moisture content at which fungi can colonize and cause decay. A wall section that dries within 6 hours after each rain event accumulates far fewer wet hours per season than one that remains damp for 24 hours or more. Localized discharge at corners, combined with poor ground clearance and no splash control, keeps certain sill segments wet longer and more often. This accelerates fungal activity and compounds freeze-thaw damage during cold months. The cause and effect relationship is straightforward. Concentrated corner discharge maximizes splash height, saturates soil immediately beside foundations, and keeps lower wall sections wet for extended periods. Distributed discharge, stone impact surfaces, and increased distance from wall to discharge point all reduce these effects. The difference between a wall that dries in 6 hours and one that stays wet for a day is a few inches of fall and where the downspout stops. Circa 1880 through 1900. A generalized frontier farmstead build reconstructed from period practice and surviving examples. On a sawhorse in a farmyard, a carpenter lays out hangers, a level, and a chalk line. He marks the center hanger position lower than the end marks. The gesture is deliberate, reversing standard catalog instruction. The technical specifications can be reconstructed from surviving installations and period building practice. Gutters of this era were typically 4 to 5 inch half-round troughs fashioned from wood with tin lining or formed entirely from galvanized metal. They were fixed to the fascia board or eave projection with iron brackets spaced at regular intervals. A typical run length along a gable eave measured 6 to 8 meters, 20 to 26 feet. The geometry of a belly gutter differs subtly but critically from standard practice. Corners are set level or slightly high. The center support is positioned 10 to 20 millimeters lower than the ends, producing a gentle downward curve across the span. This sag is barely perceptible from the ground, but sufficient to direct flow predictably toward the center. Outlets are positioned at or near the lowest point. Instead of one downpipe at each end, the belly system uses 2 short downpipes or scuppers at the center, each sized to handle roughly half the calculated peak flow. Sizing can be estimated using period rainfall intensity data. A storm dropping 1 inch per hour over a 40-foot eave length generates significant volume. Splitting that flow between 2 outlets reduces velocity at each discharge point and provides redundancy if one becomes partially blocked. Discharge termination is as important as gutter geometry. The downpipes end above a stone pad set 0.9 to 1.2 meters, roughly 3 to 4 feet, out from the wall. This distance ensures that even with splash, water does not reach the building base. The stone pad itself serves as both impact surface and drainage bed, spreading water laterally and allowing it to infiltrate or flow away rather than ponding. The layout sequence for installing a belly gutter follows logical steps. First, snap a level reference line along the fascia at the desired height. Mark corner bracket positions. Set the central bracket lower by the measured amount, 10 to 20 millimeters, depending on run length and desired flow rate. Install intermediate brackets to follow the curve, checking with a string line stretched between corner and center. Cut and fix 2 outlets at the low point, ensuring they are spaced to avoid interference and sized for the expected load. The belly slows water accumulation, reduces peak velocity at discharge, and splits the load between 2 outlets. Even if one outlet becomes partially blocked by leaves or ice, the remaining outlet and the belly's temporary storage volume reduce the chance of overtopping. The system is forgiving of minor maintenance lapses in ways that a straight gutter with single corner outlets is not. A few millimeters of intentional sag, invisible from the road, redirected hundreds of gallons to a place built to take the beating. 1880s through 1910s. Barns and farmsteads across the northern plains with documented stone splash control features. Under a central gutter outlet, grass gives way to a permanent oval of rounded stone. In heavy rain, the pad disappears under churning water. The siding above stays clean. The contrast is visible and consistent. Historic agricultural practice included various forms of surface water management around buildings. Masonry splash blocks and stone troughs appear under downspouts in carriage houses and institutional buildings designed to spread and slow concentrated discharge. Rural guidance from agricultural experiment stations discussed rubble footings and shallow drainage swales to carry surface water away from foundations. These techniques were not universal, but they were known and applied where builders had the knowledge and took the time. The technical specifications for a stone bed can be reconstructed from surviving examples and period farm management literature. The bed projects 0.9 to 1.2 meters from the wall, 3 to 4 feet in common measure. Width is typically half a meter to 7/10 of a meter. Depth of stone ranges from 150 to 200 millimeters, 6 to 8 inches. The stones are laid over graded soil that slopes gently away from the building, ensuring that water reaching the bed continues to flow downslope rather than ponding. Some installations include a rubble trench extending from the stone pad. This trench, filled with coarse stone or broken brick, acts as a primitive French drain. It intercepts water that saturates the pad and carries it further from the foundation before allowing it to infiltrate into deeper soil layers. The principle is simple. Keep water moving away from the building until it is far enough from structural elements that infiltration poses no risk. The cause and effect relationship between stone beds and reduced wall damage is documented in preservation surveys. The hard, irregular surface of the stone pad converts the kinetic energy of falling water into minor spray and lateral flow. Water is dispersed across the pad and directed away before it can pond against the base of the wall. Even in storms where discharge volume exceeds the pad's immediate drainage capacity, temporary ponding occurs on stone rather than soil. Splash from stone is less forceful and reaches lower heights than splash from bare earth. Soil saturation adjacent to foundations is also reduced. Without a stone bed, concentrated discharge creates a zone of perpetually wet soil directly beside the sill. With a stone bed positioned 1 meter out, that saturation zone is moved away from structural timber. Capillary rise and lateral moisture migration from the saturated zone have much less effect at increased distance. The result is visible in the buildings themselves. At structures where water hit stone first, decay lines in the timber dropped closer to the ground by several inches. Sills that would have required replacement after 10 to 15 years of corner discharge onto bare soil remained sound for twice that span or more when protected by belly gutters and stone pads. At buildings where water hit stone first, decay lines in the timber dropped closer to the ground by several inches. Modeled 10-year period, 1879 through 1888, based on Great Plains rainfall data and building records. A notebook comparison on a researcher's desk shows 2 sketched house sections, identical except for gutter geometry and ground treatment. The exercise is hypothetical, but grounded in documented practice and climate data. Precipitation and storm intensity reconstructions for the central and northern Great Plains during 1870 through 1889 provide the baseline. Historic storm descriptions from Army weather observations and newspaper accounts of local floods give additional detail on the frequency of high-intensity rainfall events. From this data, a picture emerges of the typical weather challenges a building would face over its first decade. The model uses 2 identical houses to isolate the effect of drainage design. House A employs straight gutters pitched to corner downspouts that discharge onto bare earth a few inches from the wall. House B uses belly gutters with twin central outlets terminating above stone pads set 1 meter out. All other variables, sill size, foundation type, siding material, orientation, maintenance frequency, are held constant. The comparison focuses on moisture exposure. Count the number of storms exceeding a given intensity, for example, rainfall at 1 inch per hour or more. Calculate the volume of water discharged at each outlet type per event. Using simple assumptions about drainage rates and evaporation, estimate the wet hours accumulated at the lower wall sections over the season. For House A, every moderate storm puts hundreds of gallons onto 2 small zones immediately beside corner sills. Splash wets the lower wall to heights of 150 to 300 millimeters. The soil beneath and beside the sill remains saturated for hours or days after each event, depending on soil type and subsequent weather. Over a decade of such exposure, the cumulative wet hours at those corner sections run into thousands. For House B, the same storms discharge onto stone beds 1 meter from the wall. Splash is minimal and does not reach the siding. The soil immediately beside the foundation is only wetted by lateral migration from the more distant saturated zone, a much slower process that affects the sill far less. The cumulative wet hours at the wall base are a fraction of House A's total. Preservation and survey reports provide real-world validation. Buildings with uncontrolled corner discharge show more frequent sill decay and siding replacement than those with managed central discharge and stone protection. The correlation is not absolute. Other factors such as wood species, initial treatment, and maintenance practices also matter, but the drainage pattern is a strong predictor of long-term condition. The economic implications become clear when repair costs are calculated. House A requires major sill or siding work once or twice in 20 years. Each intervention costs in materials, labor, and lost use time. House B requires mainly cleaning and repainting over the same period, with structural timbers remaining sound. Over a decade of storms, the difference between 2 gutters is measured not in inches of metal, but in entire courses of timber saved. Notable wet seasons in the Red River and Dakotas region, particularly 1867 and the mid-1880s. A newspaper column from spring 1887 reports roads impassable with mud. Cellars in town are flooded. River levels remain high for weeks after repeated storms. The notice is brief but conveys urgency. Similar accounts appear in other papers across the region during years of above-average precipitation. The 1867 season brought flash flood conditions to Minnesota and the Red River Basin. State water resource studies and historical weather compilations document this event as exceptional, with multiple high-intensity storms in a compressed period. Later wet spells in settled Dakota towns, particularly in the mid to late 1880s, are drawn from local histories and county records. The observed failures during these wet cycles are consistent. Corner downspouts scouring pits into bare earth, foundations exposed or undermined where discharge concentrated flow, water tracking under sills into crawl spaces and cellars, carrying mud and organic debris. Buildings that had performed adequately in average years showed hidden weaknesses when subjected to prolonged saturation. Contrasting evidence exists in the same records. Survey notes and period photographs document buildings with central outlets and stone aprons that emerged from the same wet seasons with intact lower walls and stable foundations. The difference is not absolute. No building system is immune to extreme conditions, but the frequency and severity of damage correlate with drainage design. The cause and effect relationship is straightforward. Under prolonged saturation, any weakness in a drainage system becomes a structural problem. Water that should have been moved away from the building instead accumulates beside footings. Shallow rubble foundations, common in quick frontier construction, settle or shift when the bearing soil becomes waterlogged. Sills that remain wet for weeks rather than hours experience accelerated decay. Freeze-thaw cycles compound the damage during transitional seasons. Buildings with belly gutters and stone pads maintained their integrity better because the discharge zone was positioned where saturation would not affect structural elements. Even when the stone pads themselves became submerged during peak flooding, they continued to dissipate energy and prevent direct impact on wall bases. As water receded, the increased distance from wall to saturated zone allowed foundations and sills to dry more quickly. Insurance assessors and carpenters responding to flood damage could often predict which buildings had moved or required major repairs before entering them. The diagnostic sign was simple: follow the downspouts. Buildings with corner discharge onto bare ground showed settlement and decay patterns. Buildings with central discharge onto stone showed fewer problems. County records from the years following major wet cycles document the repair burden. Appropriations for public building maintenance increased. Private owners filed insurance claims or paid out of pocket for foundation work and sill replacement. The economic impact of poor drainage design became visible in aggregate costs. In flood years, insurance assessors and carpenters could often predict which walls had moved before stepping inside, simply by following the downspouts. Winters of 1880 through 1881 and 1887 through 1888. Northern Plains towns and farmsteads enduring the hard winters. After a week of thaw and refreeze, some eaves carry heavy, uneven icicles. Gutters on several buildings hang twisted away from their fascia, metal torn or brackets pulled loose. The damage is visible from the street and represents a maintenance crisis for building owners. Historical weather reconstructions for the hard winters document prolonged periods below freezing with intermittent thaws. These cycles create ideal conditions for ice accumulation in gutters. During the day, solar radiation melts snow on roofs. Meltwater flows into gutters and begins to move toward outlets. At night, temperatures drop and the water freezes. Over repeated cycles, ice builds up in the gutters, particularly at corners where downspouts often freeze solid first, blocking drainage. The structural mechanics of ice loading are straightforward but severe. Ice weighs approximately 57 pounds per cubic foot. A 4-inch half-round gutter filled with ice for a 10-foot span carries significant weight. When that weight concentrates at unsupported corners, the leverage on end brackets is substantial. Hangers pull out from fascia boards. Metal gutters bend or tear. Wooden gutters split along the grain. Belly gutters with central support distribute ice loads differently. The lowest point of the gutter, where ice accumulates first, is supported by a bracket designed to carry the load. The shorter unsupported spans from center to corners reduce bending moments. Downspouts at the Center, being shorter and more exposed to ambient temperature variations, are less likely to freeze solid for extended periods. Even when they do freeze, the ice buildup affects a structurally supported section rather than a cantilever. Documentary evidence from memoirs and maintenance notes references gutters broken by ice and subsequently removed. Many frontier buildings had gutters installed during initial construction, but abandoned them after a hard winter destroyed the system. Preservation reports on historic buildings show typical deformation and decay patterns on cornices where gutters were torn away and never replaced, leaving eave edges exposed to decades of direct weather. The cause and effect relationship between gutter geometry and winter survival is documented but not widely emphasized in historical literature. Buildings with belly systems and central support were more likely to retain functional gutters through multiple freeze-thaw seasons. Buildings with end-hung straight gutters experienced higher failure rates and often reverted to unguttered eaves, accepting the resulting wall damage as preferable to repeated gutter replacement costs. The long-term implication is significant. A building that maintains gutter protection throughout its early decades accumulates far less moisture damage than one that loses its gutters after the first hard winter. The initial drainage design choice thus affects not only immediate performance but also the building's entire service life. Where winter tore the end-hung gutters free, many owners abandoned them entirely. Where the belly systems held, the protection stayed in place for the next year's storms. 1890 through 1910. Farm account books and town building ledgers across the northern plains documenting maintenance costs and structural repairs. In a farmhouse ledger, under improvements, a line appears every few years for paint and basic upkeep. In another ledger, whole pages track sill work, residing, foundation patching, and associated materials and labor. The difference between these two financial histories reflects choices made during initial construction. Economic data from the period provides context. Lumber prices fluctuated based on supply and demand, but followed general trends documented in railroad freight tariffs and farm supply records. Dressed pine for structural use typically costs $2 to $3 per 100 board feet delivered to interior towns, higher if hauled further from rail depots. Nails, hardware, and finishing materials added to the total. Carpenter wages ranged from $1.50 to $2.50 per day, depending on skill level and local labor availability. The comparison between drainage systems becomes an economic calculation. House A, with straight gutters and corner discharge onto bare soil, requires major sill or siding work roughly once or twice in 20 years. A typical intervention consumes 200 to 400 board feet of lumber, several pounds of nails, paint, caulking, and 3 to 5 days of skilled labor. The cost per repair ranges from $15 to $30 in period money, a substantial sum when wheat prices hover around 60 to 80 cents per bushel. House B, with belly gutters and stone pads, requires mainly routine cleaning, paint touch-up, and minor bracket adjustments over the same 2 decades. The cumulative maintenance cost is significantly lower because structural timbers remain sound. The initial additional expense of installing a belly system and stone beds, perhaps $5 to $10 in extra labor and stone placement, pays for itself within the first decade by eliminating one major repair cycle. The broader survival context matters. Northern Plains farmers in this era operated on thin margins. Drought years, crop failures, and commodity price swings could force homesteaders to abandon claims or lose property to creditors. When taxes and debt service came due, any savings in structural repair costs could be the difference between staying solvent and walking away. Farm account books that show minimal structural repair expenses tend to correlate with properties that remained in family ownership for generations. Ledgers that document frequent major repairs often appear in properties that changed hands multiple times or were eventually abandoned. The correlation is not perfect. Many factors affect farm success, but the economic burden of poor building design is real and measurable. The drainage decision is not cosmetic. It alters the long-term cash and labor demands of maintaining the structure. In aggregate across hundreds or thousands of buildings, the difference between good and poor drainage design represents substantial economic impact on frontier communities. On farms where the walls stayed dry at the base, the carpenter's line in the ledger stayed thin, and so did the chance of being forced to leave. Early 20th century onward, building codes, conservation manuals, and professional guidance documents codifying moisture management principles. A modern technical brief for historic building preservation shows a diagram. Water sheds from a roof, strikes a splash block, and runs away from the foundation. The caption warns against splashback and base saturation. The illustration is clear and prescriptive. The principle is now explicit. Keep the lower 150 to 300 millimeters of wall as dry as possible by managing where water falls and how it impacts surfaces. Modern damp-proofing practice requires impermeable barriers set well above the splash zone. Building codes mandate minimum ground clearances. Gutter installations include downspout extensions or splash blocks as standard equipment. The requirements appear in residential codes, commercial specifications, and historic preservation guidelines. The codification of these principles represents the formalization of knowledge gained through decades of building failures and incremental improvements. What began as isolated examples, builders who noticed rot patterns and adjusted their practice, became standardized guidance as the building professions matured and building science emerged as a formal discipline. Damp-proof courses, now typically made of asphalt-impregnated felt or synthetic membranes, are set at least 150 millimeters above finished grade. This specification directly accounts for expected splash height under normal precipitation conditions. Ground slopes away from foundations are required at minimum grades of 6 inches per 10 feet of horizontal distance. Downspout extensions carry water at least 4 feet from the building or discharge into buried drain lines. Precast concrete or stone splash blocks are manufactured to standard sizes and sold as routine components. The link back to frontier practice is direct. The gutter belly and stone pad represent one historically plausible configuration of a rule now written into codes and technical briefs. The specific implementation used materials and techniques available in the 1880s. The underlying principle, manage water discharge to minimize saturation at vulnerable building elements, is timeless. Historic preservation guidance specifically addresses buildings constructed without modern damp-proofing. Recommendations include installing external drainage improvements, grading soil away from foundations, adding splash blocks or aprons at downspouts, and ensuring gutters function correctly to control runoff. These interventions mirror the strategies used by careful frontier builders who understood through experience what later engineers would quantify through research. The progression from empirical observation to codified standard is typical in building practice. Methods that work are adopted. Failures are analyzed. Principles are extracted. Over time, what was once specialized knowledge becomes basic instruction in training programs and building codes. The belly gutter and stone pad are no longer common configurations. Modern materials and methods provide alternative solutions. But the principle they embody, control where water goes and what it hits, remains foundational to keeping any building dry and sound. What began as a detail visible only from the yard later appeared as a diagram line in every handbook on keeping old walls dry. Present-day surveys of 19th-century buildings in North Dakota, Minnesota, and the Dakotas region. A conservationist probes the base of a sill on an 1880s farmhouse. Below a faint mud stain line, the wood is firm. Above, paint remains largely intact. The probe finds sound timber where many buildings showed decay. The difference is documented in the field notes. Survey findings from historic preservation programs consistently show that many surviving farmsteads and outbuildings owe their condition as much to drainage and site grading as to wood species or protective coatings. Where stone aprons, proper grading, or central discharge patterns are present, lower walls are more often original fabric. Where a corner discharge onto bare soil occurred, replacement of sills and lower siding is the norm. The pattern holds across different building types and regions. Barns with central gutter outlets and stone beds beneath show less decay than barns with corner systems. Farmhouses with good site drainage and splash control retain original sills. Structures where these features are absent require more frequent and extensive interventions to remain standing. Key figures from the historical record can be recapped. Hundreds of gallons per storm managed through gutter systems. Impact zones shifted roughly 1 meter out from wall bases when stone pads were used. Wet hours at the foundation level reduced significantly over the course of seasons and years when drainage was properly controlled. Repair intervals extended from once per decade to once per generation or longer. The cause and effect relationship visible in these buildings is consistent. Controlling roof runoff preserved fabric that uncontrolled splashback destroyed. The buildings that survive in good condition are not necessarily those built with the finest materials or most skilled labor. They are the ones where water management was taken seriously from the start. Modern restoration work on historic structures often includes retrofitting drainage improvements. Gutters are repaired or replaced. Downspout extensions are added. Ground is regraded to slope away from foundations. Splash blocks are installed. These interventions stabilize buildings and prevent further decay, but they cannot reverse damage already done. The buildings that needed the least restoration work are those where such measures were original features, not later additions. The lesson for contemporary preservation is clear. Understanding how historic buildings were intended to manage water is as important as understanding their structural systems or architectural styles. The buildings that lasted are teaching documents showing what worked and what failed under real-world conditions over extended periods. The story of gutter bellies and stone pads is ultimately a story about paying attention to details that matter. The difference between success and failure in frontier building was often measured in inches and small decisions. Where those decisions were made carefully, the buildings stood. Where they were neglected, the buildings required constant repair or eventual abandonment. On the northern plains, the buildings that kept their lower walls sound were rarely the neatest on paper. They were the ones whose builders treated every storm as a load to be carried and moved the water onto stone.